Elizabeth Sullivan's hand trembled as she clutched the doctor's letter, tears blurring the words that confirmed what she already knew in her heart: she would never bear a son for her husband. The year was 1876, and in the harsh Wyoming Territory, a woman's worth was often measured by the sons she produced. Elizabeth had given Thomas 3 beautiful daughters, but in his eyes, that simply wasn't enough. "Nothing but girls again," Thomas Sullivan spat, pacing their modest cabin on the outskirts of Willow Creek. His face was flushed with anger, whiskey on his breath though it was barely past noon. 3 useless girls, and now the doctor says there won't be any more. "What good are you to me, Elizabeth?" Elizabeth flinched at his words, gathering her youngest daughter, 4-year-old Mary, closer to her skirts. 8-year-old Catherine and 6-year-old Rebecca huddled together by the hearth, their eyes wide with fear. "Thomas, please," Elizabeth whispered. "The girls can hear you." "Let them hear," Thomas shouted, slamming his fist against the wooden table. "Let them know their mother has failed in her most basic duty. Every man needs sons to work the land, to carry on his name. What am I supposed to do with daughters?" Elizabeth straightened her spine, summoning what little courage remained after 7 years of marriage to this increasingly bitter man. "Love them, Thomas. You're supposed to love them." Thomas laughed, a hollow sound that chilled Elizabeth to her core. "Love won't plow fields or brand cattle." He grabbed his hat from the hook by the door. "I'm going to town. Don't wait up." The door slammed behind him, leaving Elizabeth alone with her daughters and her shame. She knew where he was going: to Madame Rosalie's establishment at the edge of town. It wasn't the first time, and now she knew it wouldn't be the last. "Mama," Catherine asked, her small voice quavering, "is Papa angry because of us?" Elizabeth crossed the room and gathered all 3 girls into her arms. "No, my darlings, never because of you. Your father is just disappointed." "But I am not. You 3 are the greatest blessings of my life." That night, as her daughters slept, Elizabeth made a decision. She would endure Thomas's cruelty and infidelity for her daughters' sake. Where else could they go? What options did a woman with 3 young children have in this unforgiving territory? The following spring brought unusually heavy rains to Willow Creek. The creek swelled beyond its banks, and fields turned to mud. Thomas's mood darkened with each passing day as their small farm suffered. His trips to town became more frequent, his return home later each time one afternoon. As Elizabeth hung laundry while the girls played nearby, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made her pause. But it wasn't Thomas's familiar bay gelding that appeared around the bend in the road. It was a stranger on a magnificent black stallion. The man reined his horse to a stop and tipped his hat. "Afternoon, madam. Name's Daniel Morgan. My wagon's axle broke about a mile back. Might you have a husband about who could lend a hand?" Elizabeth wiped her hands on her apron, suddenly conscious of her worn dress and wind-blown hair. The stranger Daniel was tall and broad-shouldered, with kind blue eyes that crinkled at the corners. His face was tanned from the sun, with a neatly trimmed beard that couldn't hide his friendly smile. "I'm afraid my husband's gone to town, Mr. Morgan. He won't be back until late." Daniel dismounted in one fluid motion. "Then perhaps I could trouble you for some water for my horse. Poor beast has been pulling hard through this mud." "Of course." Elizabeth gestured toward the well. "Help yourself." As Daniel watered his horse, the girls abandoned their play and approached cautiously. Mary, always the boldest despite being the youngest, stepped forward first. "Mister, your horse is mighty pretty." Daniel chuckled, a warm sound that made something flutter in Elizabeth's chest. "Thank you, little lady. His name is Midnight. Can I pet him?" Mary asked. "Mary," Elizabeth admonished, "don't bother Mr. Morgan. It's no bother, madam." Daniel lifted Mary easily, settling her tiny hand on Midnight's neck. "Gentle now, like this." Catherine and Rebecca soon joined them, and Daniel showed infinite patience, answering their questions about his horse, his travels, and the silver spurs on his boots. Elizabeth watched, amazed at how naturally he interacted with her daughters. Thomas had never shown such interest. "Mr. Morgan, would you care for some lemonade before you head back to your wagon?" Elizabeth offered, surprising herself with the invitation. "That's mighty kind of you, Mrs. Sullivan." "Elizabeth Sullivan." "Mrs. Sullivan, I'd be grateful for the refreshment." Over lemonade, Elizabeth learned that Daniel was a former cavalry scout turned rancher, on his way to claim land he'd purchased sight unseen north of Willow Creek. He spoke easily and listened intently when she spoke, a courtesy she'd nearly forgotten could exist between a man and woman. "Those are fine daughters you have, Mrs. Sullivan," Daniel said as he prepared to leave. "You must be very proud." "I am," Elizabeth replied, a hint of defiance in her voice. Though not everyone sees their value. Something in Daniel's expression told her he understood the weight behind her words. "Some men can't see the treasure right before their eyes," he said quietly. "Thank you for your hospitality. I hope our paths cross again." As she watched him ride away, Elizabeth felt a strange mixture of relief and disappointment. Relief that she wouldn't have to explain Daniel's presence to Thomas, and disappointment that such a kind man was leaving. She couldn't have known then that their paths would indeed cross again, much sooner than expected. 2 weeks later, Thomas didn't come home. Elizabeth waited through the night, alternating between worry and anger. By morning, she knew she needed to go into town. She left Catherine in charge of her sisters and rode the ancient mare they kept for occasional trips. Willow Creek was a small settlement, just one main street with essential businesses: a general store, a saloon, the sheriff's office, and a handful of other establishments. Elizabeth tied her mare outside the general store and stepped inside, where she found Mrs. Abernathy, the storekeeper's wife, organizing bolts of fabric. "Good morning, Mrs. Sullivan," Mrs. Abernathy said, her eyebrows rising in surprise. "Elizabeth rarely came to town. What brings you in today?" "I'm looking for Thomas. He didn't come home last night." Mrs. Abernathy's face fell. "Oh, my dear, you haven't heard." Elizabeth's heart clenched. "Heard what? Your husband. He left on the morning stage yesterday with Vivian Russell." The room seemed to tilt beneath Elizabeth's feet. Vivian Russell was one of Madame Rosalie's girls, young, pretty, and known for entertaining many of the town's married men. "He left a letter for you with Sheriff Parker," Mrs. Abernathy continued, her voice gentle. "I'm so sorry, Elizabeth." Numbly, Elizabeth made her way to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Parker, a gruff but fair man in his 50s, handed her an envelope without meeting her eyes. Inside was a brief note in Thomas's hasty scrawl. "Elizabeth, I've gone to California with Vivian. She's expecting my son. I've left the deed to the farm with Parker. It's worthless land anyway. Do what you will with the girls." Thomas, the words blurred as tears filled Elizabeth's eyes. Not tears of heartbreak, but of humiliation and fear. Thomas had abandoned her and their daughters for a saloon girl who promised him a son. "There's more," Sheriff Parker said reluctantly. "Thomas had gambling debts, considerable ones. The farm's been mortgaged to cover them, but there's still money owed. The bank will be foreclosing at the end of the month." Elizabeth felt the floor drop out from beneath her. "But where will we go? What will we do?" Sheriff Parker shook his head. "I wish I had answers for you, Mrs. Sullivan, but you've got 3 weeks to figure something out." The ride back to the farm was the longest of Elizabeth's life. How would she tell her daughters their father had abandoned them? How would she provide for them with no money, no skills beyond farming and homemaking, and nowhere to go? As she approached the farm, she saw an unfamiliar wagon in front of the cabin. For a wild moment, she thought perhaps Thomas had returned, that the letter had been some cruel joke. But as she drew closer, she recognized the tall figure standing on her porch, Daniel Morgan. He turned at the sound of her approach, and something in his expression told her he already knew. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, removing his hat. "I heard about your situation in town. I came to see if I could be of assistance." Elizabeth dismounted, her legs nearly giving way beneath her. "You heard already, small towns," Daniel said apologetically. "Word travels fast. So everyone knows my husband left me for a saloon girl who's giving him the son I couldn't provide." Elizabeth's voice broke on the last words. Daniel stepped closer, his face solemn. "What I heard is that a fool of a man abandoned his family, nothing more." Elizabeth looked past him to where her daughters played with a small puppy she didn't recognize. "What's that?" "A peace offering," Daniel admitted. "I thought the girls might like him. His name's Rusty." "Mr. Morgan, Daniel, please. Daniel, I appreciate your kindness, but I can't accept a dog. I don't even know where we'll be living in 3 weeks' time." Daniel's expression grew serious. That's partly why I'm here, Mrs. Sullivan. I've established my ranch about 10 miles north. It's good land with a solid house. There's a smaller cabin on the property that my foreman was going to use, but he's decided to stay in town with his sweetheart. He paused. You and your daughters are welcome to it if you'd like. Elizabeth stared at him in disbelief. You're offering us a place to live. Why would you do that for strangers? I need help running the ranch, Daniel said practically. I could use someone to cook for the hands and manage the household. The cabin would be payment, along with a small wage. He hesitated. And your daughters would have a safe place to grow up. It was the mention of her daughters that nearly undid Elizabeth. I can't impose. It's not imposing if I'm asking for your help in return, Daniel said firmly. And Elizabeth, his use of her first name sent a small shock through her. Those girls of yours are a treasure. Any man worth his salt would see that. The sincerity in his eyes made something long dormant stir in Elizabeth's heart. Here was a man offering them shelter with no expectation beyond honest work, a man who saw value in her daughters when their own father hadn't. Can I think about it? She asked, though she already knew her answer. What choice did she really have? Daniel nodded. Of course. I'll come back in a few days for your decision. True to his word, Daniel returned 3 days later. By then, Elizabeth had told her daughters a gentler version of the truth, that their father had gone away and wouldn't be coming back, but that they would be all right. To her surprise, the girls had accepted the news with remarkable resilience. Thomas had never been an affectionate father, and his absence created less of a void than Elizabeth had feared. When Daniel arrived, Elizabeth was ready with her answer. We accept your offer, Mr. Morgan Daniel. But I want to be clear that this is a business arrangement. I'll work hard for you, but my daughters come first. Daniel's smile was warm. I wouldn't have it any other way. 2 weeks later, Elizabeth and her daughters arrived at the Morgan Ranch with their few belongings. The main house was a handsome 2-story structure of timber and stone, but it was the cabin that took Elizabeth's breath away. Though smaller than their old home, it was well built and clean with 2 bedrooms, a cozy kitchen, and windows that let in streams of sunlight. It's perfect, she whispered, watching her daughters explore their new home with excitement. It's yours for as long as you want it, Daniel said simply. Life at the Morgan Ranch quickly fell into a routine. Elizabeth rose early to prepare breakfast for Daniel and his 4 ranch hands. She cleaned the main house, tended a vegetable garden, and prepared the other meals of the day. The work was hard but satisfying, and for the first time in years she felt valued. Daniel proved to be a fair and generous employer. He insisted the girls attend the small school that had recently opened 5 miles away, even providing a gentle pony for Catherine to ride there with her sisters. He never raised his voice, never drank to excess, and always treated Elizabeth with a respect that made her previous life with Thomas seem like a bad dream. As summer turned to fall, Elizabeth noticed subtle changes in her relationship with Daniel. Their conversations grew longer, more personal. He began joining her and the girls for supper in the cabin several nights a week. When Mary caught a fever that left Elizabeth exhausted from worry and sleepless nights, it was Daniel who took over her duties at the main house without complaint, even sitting by Mary's bedside reading stories while Elizabeth rested. One evening in late October, after the girls had gone to bed, Daniel lingered at Elizabeth's table over coffee. I've been meaning to ask you something, he said, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. The harvest dance is next Saturday in town. Would you and the girls consider accompanying me? Elizabeth looked up in surprise. As your employees, Daniel met her gaze steadily. As my guests, Elizabeth, as people I care about. The simple admission made her heart race. Daniel, I'm still married, technically. I know, he said quietly, and I respect that. But Thomas made his choice, and I don't believe you're bound to honor vows he so thoroughly broke. He reached across the table, his hand stopping just short of hers. I'm not asking for anything improper. Just a dance, maybe. A chance to show you and your daughters a good time. Elizabeth thought of how different Daniel was from Thomas, how he played with her daughters, listened when she spoke, valued her opinions. How he looked at her sometimes when he thought she wouldn't notice, with a warmth that made her feel beautiful despite her worn dresses and work-roughened hands. Yes, she said softly, we'd love to accompany you. The harvest dance changed everything. Elizabeth wore her best dress, a deep blue calico she'd carefully altered. Daniel had brought hair ribbons for the girls and a simple silver brooch for Elizabeth, just a small token, he'd said, though the gift clearly held meaning. The whole town was there, and Elizabeth felt the weight of curious stares. Everyone knew her story, knew she was living on Daniel Morgan's ranch. But as Daniel led her confidently onto the dance floor, his hand warm and steady at her waist, she found she didn't care what anyone thought. "You look beautiful tonight," Daniel murmured as they moved to the music. "Thank you," Elizabeth replied, a blush warming her cheeks. "Though I'm sure I'm the subject of much gossip." Daniel's expression hardened slightly. "Let them talk. Anyone who knows what Thomas did would understand." "And what exactly did Thomas do?" The sharp voice came from behind them, and Elizabeth turned to find herself face to face with Harriet Simmons, one of the town's most notorious gossips. "Mrs. Simmons," Daniel acknowledged coolly. "People are talking, Mrs. Sullivan," Harriet said, ignoring Daniel. "Living alone with a single man, bringing your daughters into such an arrangement, it's not proper." Before Elizabeth could respond, Daniel stepped slightly forward. "Mrs. Sullivan works for me as my housekeeper, Mrs. Simmons. Her reputation is beyond reproach." Unlike her husband, who abandoned his family for a saloon girl, Harriet's mouth tightened. "Well, I heard he left because she couldn't give him sons. Every man wants sons." The words struck Elizabeth like a physical blow. Daniel must have felt her stiffen because his arm tightened protectively around her. "Any man who values sons over daughters is a fool," Daniel said, his voice carrying enough for those nearby to hear. "Elizabeth's girls are worth 10 of any son Thomas Sullivan might have. I'd be proud to call them my own." A hush fell over those close enough to hear. Elizabeth stared up at Daniel, seeing the sincerity in his eyes, the quiet anger on her behalf. "Come," he said gently to Elizabeth. "I believe I promised Catherine the next dance." As they walked away, Elizabeth felt something shift inside her, a realization that she was developing feelings for this man that went far beyond gratitude. Winter came early that year, bringing bitter cold and heavy snow. Elizabeth worried about Daniel working in such conditions, and found herself watching anxiously each evening until she saw him return safely to the main house. The girls, too, had grown attached to him. He taught Catherine to ride properly, showed Rebecca how to whittle simple figures from wood, and never tired of Mary's endless questions. One night, after a particularly severe blizzard, Daniel appeared at the cabin door looking exhausted. "2 calves were born during the storm," he explained as Elizabeth ushered him inside. "Been trying to keep them alive in the barn." "Sit," Elizabeth commanded, pouring him coffee and setting out a plate of stew she'd kept warm. The girls, already in their nightgowns, crowded around to hear about the calves. "Will they live, Mr. Daniel?" Mary asked anxiously. Daniel smiled tiredly. "I think so, little one. Their mama's doing well now, too." "Can we see them tomorrow?" Catherine asked. "If your mother agrees and if the weather clears," Daniel said, looking to Elizabeth for confirmation. She nodded, touched by his deference to her authority with her daughters. "Of course. Now girls, say good night to Mr. Morgan. He needs his rest." After the girls had gone to bed, Elizabeth sat across from Daniel at the table. "You should go get some rest yourself. You look exhausted." Daniel didn't move. "There's something I need to say first, Elizabeth." The seriousness in his voice made her nervous. "Is something wrong?" "No," he said quickly. "Nothing's wrong, it's just—" He took a deep breath. "I've been thinking a lot about you and the girls." Elizabeth's heart began to pound. "Oh, I care for you, Elizabeth, more than I should, perhaps, given your situation, but I can't help it." His eyes, so blue and earnest, held hers. "I love your daughters as if they were my own, and I love you." Elizabeth couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. "I know you're still married," Daniel continued, "but there are lawyers in Cheyenne who could help with a divorce, given the circumstances. If you wanted that." He reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "I'm not asking for an answer now, just for you to think about it, about us, about what kind of future we might build together." Tears filled Elizabeth's eyes. "Daniel," a sharp knock at the door interrupted her. Daniel rose to answer it, revealing one of the ranch hands, snow-covered and breathless. "Sorry to interrupt, boss, but there's a man at the main house asking for Mrs. Sullivan. Says he's her husband." Elizabeth felt the blood drain from her face. Thomas. Here, after nearly 8 months without a word, Daniel's expression hardened. "Tell him we'll be right there." He turned to Elizabeth. "You don't have to see him if you don't want to." Elizabeth stood, squaring her shoulders. "No, I need to face him, but the girls are asleep," Daniel finished. "Let them stay that way for now." The walk to the main house seemed endless. When they entered, Thomas was standing by the fire, looking thinner and harder than Elizabeth remembered. His eyes narrowed when he saw Daniel beside her. "So the rumors are true," Thomas said coldly. "You've taken up with another man." "Mrs. Sullivan works for me," Daniel said evenly. "She's under my protection, but not in the way you're implying." Thomas laughed harshly. "Protection? Is that what they're calling it these days?" He turned to Elizabeth. "I've come to take you and the girls back." Elizabeth stared at him in disbelief. "Back, after you abandoned us for another woman, after you gambled away our home. Things didn't work out with Vivian," Thomas admitted, at least having the grace to look somewhat ashamed. "She lost the baby, a son the doctor said." The irony was almost too much. "And now you want us back, just like that. You're my wife, Elizabeth. The girls are my daughters. I made a mistake." "A mistake?" Daniel's voice was dangerously quiet. "You left them destitute. You chose another woman because your wife gave you daughters instead of sons, as though that was something she could control." Thomas's face flushed with anger. "This isn't your business, Morgan." "It became my business when I found your wife wondering how she'd feed your daughters after you abandoned them," Daniel replied, his hands clenched at his sides. Elizabeth stepped between the two men. "Thomas, you need to leave. Whatever we had is over." "You can't keep my daughters from me," Thomas growled. "Your daughters," Elizabeth's voice rose. "The ones you called useless. The ones you left without a backward glance. The ones who haven't asked about you once in 8 months because you were never a father to them when you were here." Thomas took a step toward her, his expression ugly. Daniel moved faster, placing himself between them. "Don't," Daniel warned, his voice low. "Don't take another step." For a tense moment, Elizabeth thought Thomas might try to fight, but something in Daniel's stance must have warned him off. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document. "Fine, but I want compensation for my property. This man has been harboring my wife and children. I'll sign divorce papers, but I want payment." Elizabeth felt sick at his mercenary attitude. Even now, Thomas saw them as possessions, not people. Daniel didn't hesitate. "How much?" Thomas named a figure that made Elizabeth gasp far more than she was worth in Thomas's eyes when he'd left her. "Done," Daniel said immediately. "I'll have the bank draft ready tomorrow, along with divorce papers for you to sign." Thomas looked surprised at Daniel's quick agreement, then calculating. "Make it double." "Thomas," Elizabeth exclaimed, outraged. Daniel remained calm. "The original amount is more than fair for a man who abandoned his family. Take it or leave with nothing." Something in Daniel's tone must have convinced Thomas he wouldn't get more. "Fine, tomorrow then." He looked at Elizabeth. "Tell the girls, tell them whatever you want." After Thomas left, Elizabeth's legs gave way and she sank into a chair. "I can't believe he came back, and then tried to sell us to you." Daniel knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "Elizabeth, look at me. I would have paid any amount to keep you and the girls safe, but that's not what this is about. You're not property to be bought and sold. Tomorrow you'll be free of him. After that, whatever happens between us will be your choice, only yours." The next day, Thomas signed the divorce papers without argument, took his payment, and left on the afternoon stage. He didn't ask to see the girls. Elizabeth watched him go with a strange mixture of relief and lingering anger, not that he was leaving again, but that he'd come back at all, disrupting the peace she'd found. Daniel stood beside her as the stage disappeared down the road. "Are you all right?" Elizabeth turned to him, seeing the concern in his eyes, the love he'd declared the night before. "Yes," she said, surprised to find it was true. "I am." That evening, after explaining to the girls that their father had come and gone, and that she and Daniel had something important to discuss with them, Elizabeth sat with Daniel on the porch of the cabin. The spring air was cool but not cold, and the stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "I've been thinking about what you said last night," Elizabeth began. Before Thomas arrived, Daniel looked at her. Hope and uncertainty mingled in his expression. And I think I've been falling in love with you since the day you put my daughter on your horse and showed her how to pet him gently." Elizabeth smiled, remembering. No one had ever treated my girls with such natural kindness before. Daniel took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "They're easy to love, Elizabeth, just like their mother." "You told Thomas you would have paid any amount for us," Elizabeth said softly. "Did you mean that?" "Every word," Daniel replied without hesitation. "But I don't want to buy you, Elizabeth. I want to earn your love, your trust. I want to be a father to those girls, to show them what a good man looks like, how a good man treats the women he loves." "You already have," Elizabeth whispered, tears filling her eyes. "You already do." Daniel leaned forward, his hand gently cupping her cheek. "Then will you marry me, Elizabeth Sullivan? Will you and your daughters make my house a home, make my life complete?" Elizabeth's answer was in her kiss, in the way she moved into his arms as naturally as if she'd always belonged there. When they finally pulled apart, she whispered, "Yes." Behind them, a small cheer erupted. They turned to find Catherine, Rebecca, and Mary watching from the doorway, their faces alight with happiness. "Does this mean Mr. Daniel will be our papa now?" Mary asked, running to climb into Daniel's lap. Daniel looked at Elizabeth, his eyes asking permission. At her nod, he gathered Mary close. "If you'll have me, little one, I'd be honored to be your papa." "Will you be a good papa?" Rebecca asked seriously, approaching more cautiously. "I'll try my very best every day," Daniel promised. "I'll make mistakes sometimes, but I'll always love you, always protect you, and always be proud of you." Catherine, the oldest and most affected by Thomas's treatment, studied Daniel carefully. "Our real father didn't want daughters, he wanted sons." Daniel looked her straight in the eye. "Then he was a fool, Catherine. There's nothing a son can do that a daughter can't if she's given the chance, and I'll make sure you three have every chance." Catherine's reserved expression finally broke into a smile. "Then I think you'll be a very good papa." They were married 2 weeks later in the town church, the girls serving as Elizabeth's attendants. The ceremony was simple but joyful, attended by the ranch hands and a few townspeople who had come to respect Elizabeth's quiet dignity over the past months. That night, after the girls were asleep in their room in the main house, no longer the cabin, but the home Daniel had built with dreams of a family, Elizabeth stood in the doorway of their bedroom, suddenly shy. Daniel crossed to her, taking her hands in his. "We have all the time in the world, Elizabeth. There's no rush for anything." Elizabeth looked up at this man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved, who loved her daughters as his own, who saw strength where Thomas had seen only failure. "I'm not afraid," she said softly. "Not with you." Later, as they lay tangled together in the quiet darkness, Daniel traced the curve of her cheek with gentle fingers. "I've dreamed of this," he murmured. "Of you here, of our family, Elizabeth repeated, marveling at the words. "Daniel, what if? What if we only ever have daughters? Would you truly be content?" Daniel propped himself up on one elbow, looking down at her with such tenderness it made her heart ache. "Elizabeth, listen to me. I meant what I said to Catherine. There's nothing a son can do that a daughter can't. If we're blessed with more children, boy or girl, I'll love them exactly the same. But even if it's just us and those 3 amazing girls sleeping down the hall, I'll consider myself the luckiest man alive." Elizabeth believed him completely. In that moment, all the shame and inadequacy Thomas had made her feel washed away, replaced by the certainty of Daniel's love not just for her, but for the daughters she had borne, the family they now made together. 2 years later, Elizabeth gave birth to twins, both girls. When the midwife announced the news, Daniel's face split into a wide grin. 5 daughters, he said proudly, cradling one tiny infant while Elizabeth held the other. 5 brilliant, beautiful, perfect daughters. What did I do to deserve such riches? Elizabeth smiled up at her husband, surrounded by Catherine, Rebecca, and Mary, all peering excitedly at their new sisters. "You loved us," she said simply. "When we needed it most, you loved us." Daniel leaned down to kiss her, his eyes shining with joy. "And I always will," he promised. Every one of you, every day, for the rest of my life.